Colonel Abraham Buford raised the white flag of surrender. His Virginia Continentals had been run down after a 140-mile chase through the South Carolina heat. Tarleton's cavalry surrounded them on three sides, sabers drawn, horses lathered. And then a musket ball killed Tarleton's horse beneath him. The British Legion saw their commander fall under a flag of truce. They believed the Americans had shot him during a surrender parley. A bayonet charge erupted across the field. 113 men were butchered where they stood. 150 more were wounded so savagely that their injuries became a propaganda weapon. The phrase, Tarleton's Quarter, spread through the Carolinas like fire through dry brush. It meant no mercy. It meant the British Army under Banastre Tarleton would slaughter you whether you fought or not. And it turned a cavalry commander into the most hated man in America. The events that built that reputation began 2 years earlier, in the summer of 1778, when the British Army authorized the creation of a new provincial unit unlike anything they had fielded before. The British Legion was composed largely of American loyalists, men who had lost their homes, their farms, and their standing in the rebellion that was tearing the colonies apart. They were refugees, in a sense, but they were refugees who wanted to fight. The British command saw an opportunity. These men knew the terrain of the southern colonies with an intimacy no imported redcoat could match. They knew the roads, the fords, the farms where sympathizers might offer shelter. They also burned with a personal hatred for the Patriot cause that made them relentless in pursuit. And the officer chosen to lead them was a 24-year-old cavalryman named Banastre Tarleton. Tarleton was born in Liverpool in 1754, the son of a wealthy merchant and slave trader. His father had served as mayor of Liverpool, and the family's money opened doors. He purchased a commission as a cornet in the 1st King's Dragoon Guards, an expensive entry ticket into the professional officer corps of the British Army. But Tarleton was not satisfied with a purchased rank and a comfortable post. He volunteered for service in the American War, arriving in North America in 1776 as part of General Cornwallis's expedition. Almost immediately, he distinguished himself, not through lineage, not through wealth, but through an almost unnatural talent for aggressive cavalry warfare. Where other officers hesitated, Tarleton attacked. Where other commanders rested their horses, Tarleton pushed forward through exhaustion, darkness, and terrain that seemed impassable. He understood something fundamental about mounted warfare in the American colonies. Speed was everything. A cavalry force that moved faster than anyone expected could appear where no one thought possible. And if it struck hard enough on arrival, the shock alone could shatter a larger force before the fighting even began. The British Legion was built around this philosophy. It was a mixed force of cavalry and light infantry, designed to move fast and hit hard. The cavalry arm was its backbone, mounted on the best horses the British could procure, armed with sabers and pistols, trained to charge in close order and break enemy formations. The infantry component rode into battle behind the cavalry or marched at a punishing pace, dismounting to fight on foot with the accuracy and speed of light troops. Together, they were a weapon system designed for one purpose: relentless pursuit. The Legion's first major test came in the spring of 1780. The British Southern Campaign was in full motion, and General Henry Clinton had just captured Charleston after a siege that lasted over a month. The fall of Charleston was a catastrophe for the Patriot cause. More than 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered, along with the entire artillery train and stores of ammunition that the Southern Army could not replace. But the victory was incomplete as long as American cavalry units still operated in the South Carolina countryside, raiding supply lines and threatening British outposts. General Clinton ordered Tarleton to eliminate one of those threats. On the night of April 13, 1780, a force of American cavalry under General Isaac Huger camped at a place called Monk's Corner, about 30 miles north of Charleston. Huger's men were exhausted. They had been retreating for days, trying to stay ahead of the British advance after the fall of the city. Huger posted sentries and ordered his men to sleep with their horses saddled, but no one expected the British to find them before morning. Tarleton found them before morning. He had marched his legion through a swamp in total darkness, a route that local guides had told him was impassable. The column moved in silence, no lanterns, no drums, the only sound the sucking of hooves in mud and the creak of leather tack. They emerged from the swamp at 3 in the morning and charged directly into Huger's sleeping camp. The Americans had no time to form lines. Men scrambled from their blankets, reaching for muskets they could not find in the dark. Tarleton's troopers cut through the camp at a gallop, sabers rising and falling, horses trampling campfires and sending sparks showering into the night sky. Huger himself barely escaped. He fled into the swamp on foot, leaving behind his equipment, his papers, and his command. 41 Americans were killed or wounded in the chaos. Tarleton lost only a handful of men and captured horses, weapons, and supplies that the Continental Army in the South could not afford to replace. Monck's Corner was not a large battle by the standards of the war, but it demonstrated what Tarleton could do. He could move faster than his enemies believed possible, arrive at a time and place they believed impossible, and destroy them before they understood they were under attack. Cornwallis, who took over command of the Southern campaign shortly after Charleston fell, recognized the value of that talent immediately. He gave Tarleton wide latitude to operate independently, and Tarleton used it. In the weeks following Monck's Corner, the British Legion roamed the South Carolina backcountry like a hunting pack. They pursued retreating Continental detachments, scattered militia musters before they could organize, and burned farms suspected of harboring Patriot partisans. The speed of the Legion became legendary, and so did the fear that preceded it. Patriot families in the path of Tarleton's advance hid their sons and buried their silver. Militia officers warned each other that Tarleton gave no quarter, that his men were loyalists who had lost everything and wanted revenge, that surrender was the same as suicide. Some of those warnings were exaggerated. Some of them were not. On May 29, 1780, the warnings became a historical fact. 3 weeks after Charleston surrendered, a column of Virginia Continentals under Colonel Abraham Buford was retreating north through the Carolina interior. Buford commanded roughly 350 men from the 3rd Virginia Detachment, regular soldiers who had been marching south to reinforce Charleston when they received word that the city had already fallen. Their orders now were to withdraw, preserve their force, and join the remnants of the Continental Army in North Carolina. They were not looking for a fight. Tarleton was looking for them. Cornwallis had learned of Buford's position and dispatched Tarleton with orders to run the Virginians down before they could escape the theater. It was a punishing pursuit. Tarleton covered 105 miles in 54 hours, an almost absurd pace through the South Carolina summer heat. The horses were pushed to the edge of collapse. Infantrymen rode double behind cavalry mounts or jogged alongside the column, shedding equipment to keep up. By the time the Legion closed on Buford's position near the Waxhaws settlement, Tarleton had about 270 men still able to fight. Buford still outnumbered him, but the Virginians were strung out on the march and moving slowly with their wagon train. Tarleton sent a demand for surrender under a flag of truce. Buford refused. He reportedly told the British emissary that he rejected the terms and would defend his command. Tarleton attacked immediately. The British Legion cavalry charged the rear of Buford's column before the Virginians could form a defensive line. Buford's men had no time to deploy their artillery or organize their ranks. The cavalry hit them at a full gallop, and the column began to disintegrate. And then Buford realized the fight was hopeless. He ordered a white flag raised. In the protocols of 18th century warfare, a raised white flag meant the fighting stopped immediately. Officers from both sides would meet, terms would be discussed, and the defeated force would lay down its arms. But as the white flag went up, a shot rang out across the field. Tarleton's horse crumpled beneath him, killed by a musket ball. The British troopers saw their commander go down in the dirt. They saw the white flag still fluttering above the American line, and they concluded, in the frenzy and confusion of close combat, that the Americans had violated the truce, that they had raised a flag of surrender and then shot the commanding officer during a parley. The Legion did not wait. Wounded men on the ground were stabbed where they lay. The Virginians, trapped between the cavalry and the wagon train, had nowhere to run. Some attempted to fight back, but most simply tried to survive the fury that had engulfed them. The bayonet wounds were so extensive that American surgeons who later treated the survivors recorded patterns of injury they had rarely seen in the war. Multiple puncture wounds, slash wounds across backs and shoulders, men stabbed after they were already incapacitated. When it was over, 113 Americans were dead. 150 were wounded, many of them so severely that they died in the following days or were permanently disabled. 53 were taken prisoner. The British Legion had suffered 5 killed and 12 wounded. The disparity in casualties was so extreme that it could not be explained by the normal chaos of battle. Something had happened at the Waxhaws that was beyond the ordinary brutality of 18th century warfare. Tarleton himself, writing years later in his history of the campaign, claimed that the Americans had fired on his men under a flag of truce. He defended the actions of his legion as a necessary response to a violation of the rules of war. He also argued, with some justification, that the bayonet charge was standard British tactical doctrine. The goal was to shock and overrun an enemy position before it could reform, and bayonet attacks were the fastest way to achieve that in close quarters. But the scale of the killing and the specific nature of the wounds told a different story to the Patriots who saw the aftermath. The Waxhaws was not just a battlefield anywhere. It was a place where men who had surrendered were executed, and the Patriot propaganda machine understood immediately what that meant. Within weeks, printed accounts of the massacre were circulating through the southern colonies. The phrase "Tarleton's quarter" entered the American vocabulary. It meant no quarter would be given. It meant that if you faced Tarleton's legion, you fought to the death because surrender was not an option. The effect on recruitment for the Patriot cause was electric. Militiamen who had been wavering in their loyalties, unsure whether to join the rebellion or stay home, saw the reports from the Waxhaws and made their choice. If the British were going to slaughter them whether they fought or not, then they might as well fight. The man most responsible for amplifying the Waxhaws' atrocity was a South Carolina lawyer named Aedanus Burke. Burke published pamphlets and broadsides that described in graphic detail the bayonet wounds inflicted on Buford's men. He called Tarleton a butcher and the British Legion a gang of murderers. His writing was emotional, vivid, and devastatingly effective. Every militia officer in the Carolinas read those accounts, or heard them read aloud in taverns and meeting houses. The word spread beyond the South. Newspapers in Philadelphia, Boston, and New York reprinted the accounts of the Waxhaws Massacre. Tarleton's name became synonymous with British cruelty across all 13 colonies. And the irony was that Tarleton's brutality, which had been intended to terrify the Southern population into submission, was doing exactly the opposite. It was creating an army. Patriot partisans in the South Carolina backcountry, men like Francis Marion and Thomas Sumter, used the Waxhaws as a recruitment tool. They told the young men of the upcountry that the British had offered them a choice between submission and extermination. The only answer was to fight. By the summer of 1780, the southern colonies that the British had expected to pacify after the fall of Charleston were instead erupting into a guerrilla war. Tarleton's legion continued to operate at a punishing pace. They burned farms, hanged suspected spies, and hunted the partisan bands that were now multiplying across the countryside. But every raid, every execution, every farm burned fed the cycle of violence. Loyalist families were attacked in retaliation. Patriot families were attacked in response. The war in the South was devolving into a civil conflict where neighbors killed neighbors, and the rules of civilized warfare had ceased to apply. Tarleton was at the center of that maelstrom, and his superiors saw him as essential to British strategy. Cornwallis praised Tarleton's energy and effectiveness in official dispatches to London. The speed of the British Legion, Cornwallis argued, was the only thing preventing the southern backcountry from being completely overrun by Patriot partisans. Without Tarleton, the British occupation of South Carolina would collapse from 1,000 small cuts inflicted by men who fought from ambush and then vanished into the swamps. But even as Cornwallis wrote those dispatches, the political ground was shifting beneath his feet. Every atrocity attributed to Tarleton's legion, whether verified or not, was driving more colonists into the Patriot camp. The British Army in the South had roughly 8,000 soldiers. The population of the Carolinas was hundreds of thousands. If the majority of those civilians turned against the Crown, no amount of tactical brilliance could save the occupation. Tarleton seemed not to care about that calculation. Or perhaps he understood it and simply believed that terror could succeed where conciliation failed. If the colonists could be made to fear the consequences of rebellion more than they feared submission, the rebellion would end. It was a theory of counter-insurgency that had worked in other times and other places, but it was not working in the Carolinas. The colonists were not submitting. They were sharpening their knives and loading their muskets, and they were waiting for a moment when Tarleton's luck would run out. That moment was still months away, in the cold January of 1781, on a cattle pasture called Cowpens. But before the reckoning, there would be more blood. There would be Fishing Creek, where Tarleton would surprise another American camp in the darkness and kill 150 men before they could lift their weapons. There would be the burning, the hanging, the relentless pursuit through the pine barrens and swamps. And there would be a general named Daniel Morgan, a veteran of the French and Indian War, who studied Tarleton's tactics with the cold precision of a man who understood exactly what he was facing. Morgan saw what others had missed. Tarleton's speed was also his weakness. He attacked so fast that his men often arrived exhausted, their formations strung out. He was so aggressive that he could be baited into attacking a position that looked weak but was actually a trap. And he was so confident in his own invincibility that he would never consider the possibility that an army of farmers and militia could stand and fight. Morgan would test that confidence. At Cowpens, he would build a defense designed specifically to exploit every one of Tarleton's weaknesses. And when the trap closed, the butcher of the Waxhaws would find himself on the wrong side of the bayonets for the first time in his career. The summer heat in South Carolina baked the red clay roads into dust. Charleston had fallen on May 12, 1780. The largest city in the American South was now a British garrison. General Benjamin Lincoln surrendered over 5,000 Continental soldiers and militia in the single worst American defeat of the entire war. Cornwallis believed the southern colonies were broken. He was wrong. The backcountry did not surrender with Charleston. In the dense pine forests and tangled swamps west of the city, armed bands of Patriot partisans were already forming. They called themselves the Swamp Fox's Men, the Gamecock's Volunteers, the fighting men of the upcountry. They had no formal uniforms, no supply lines, and no intention of fighting a conventional war. Their strategy was simple: strike fast, kill a few redcoats, and vanish into the terrain they had known since childhood. General Thomas Sumter was one of their most aggressive leaders. A former Continental officer with a hard face and a harder reputation, Sumter operated out of hidden camps in the Catawba River region. His men called him the Gamecock. The British called him a terrorist. Tarleton called him prey. Throughout July and August of 1780, Tarleton's legion pushed deeper into the backcountry at a pace that shattered every standard of 18th-century cavalry operations. British dragoons typically marched 15 to 20 miles in a day. Tarleton drove his men 40, 50, sometimes 60 miles in a single push. Horses collapsed under their riders and were left to die on the roadside. Infantrymen marched until their boots disintegrated and their feet bled through the rags they wrapped around them. Tarleton did not slow down for stragglers. He did not stop for heat exhaustion or empty supply wagons. His legion moved like a predator that could not afford to lose the scent. The tactic worked because it broke the enemy's ability to plan. Partisan leaders like Sumter and Francis Marion expected British columns to move at a predictable pace. They calculated their strikes based on how long it would take a conventional force to respond. Tarleton's speed made those calculations useless. A raid that should have given the partisans 2 days to escape was suddenly met by British cavalry in 6 hours. Sumter's men learned to fear the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. A cloud of dust on the horizon could mean Tarleton's advanced guard closing the gap. If the partisans did not break camp within minutes of spotting the dust, they would not break camp at all. The Legion earned its reputation for brutality through more than just battlefield conduct. Tarleton understood that terror was a weapon, and he wielded it deliberately. Farms suspected of sheltering partisans were put to the torch. Livestock was slaughtered or driven off. Crops were burned in the fields, condemning families to hunger through the coming winter. Men captured in arms against the crown were sometimes hanged on the spot, their bodies left swinging from roadside trees as a warning. The message was unambiguous. Resisting the king's authority meant death, and not just for the man who pulled the trigger. It meant death for his family, destruction for his farm, and ashes for everything he had built. This was not random cruelty. It was a calculated doctrine of counter-insurgency, one that British commanders believed had worked in Scotland after the Jacobite Rising of 1745. Punish the population so severely that they would never rise again. The doctrine had a flaw, however. It only worked if the population believed that submission would end the punishment. In the Carolinas, the colonists had stopped believing that long before Tarleton arrived. The word from Aidanus Burke's pamphlets had spread far beyond the printing presses of Philadelphia and Boston. It had reached the backcountry, where many colonists could not read but could listen. Burke's descriptions of the Waxhaws were read aloud in taverns, at militia musters, and in the log meeting houses where settlers gathered on Sundays. Men who had been neutral, waiting to see which side would win, heard those accounts and reached for their muskets. The phrase Tarleton's Quarter became shorthand for a simple truth. If the British caught you, they would kill you whether you surrendered or not. So you might as well fight. Tarleton seemed either unaware of this dynamic or unwilling to acknowledge it. He continued to believe that speed and shock could overwhelm the Patriots' will to resist. His official correspondence during the summer of 1780 reflected this conviction. In reports to Cornwallis, he described the partisans as a rabble that would scatter at the first sight of British steel. He was not entirely wrong about their military capability. Most of Sumter's men had no formal training. They were armed with hunting rifles, not military muskets, and they carried whatever ammunition they could scavenge. In a stand-up fight against disciplined infantry, they would almost certainly break. Tarleton's mission was to force exactly that kind of fight. The challenge was finding Sumter before Sumter found him. The Gamecock was not interested in a stand-up fight. He wanted supply convoys, isolated outposts, and small patrols that could be overwhelmed by superior numbers in an ambush. On August 15, 1780, the main British army under Cornwallis crushed the Continental forces at the Battle of Camden. General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, fled the field in disgrace. His army disintegrated, leaving the Carolinas almost entirely under British control. Almost, but not completely. While Gates was losing Camden, Sumter had been successfully raiding British supply lines along the Wateree River. He captured a convoy of wagons loaded with ammunition, food, and equipment meant for Cornwallis's army. He also took roughly 100 British prisoners. It was a significant blow, and Sumter knew it. He pulled his force back to a campsite near Fishing Creek, a tributary of the Catawba River, about 40 miles from Camden. The location was well chosen. Thick woods provided cover from observation. The creek offered water for the men and horses. The roads leading into the camp were narrow and easily guarded. Sumter believed he had put enough distance between himself and the main British army to rest his men safely. He had roughly 800 soldiers under his command, along with the captured British prisoners and the wagon train of supplies. His men were exhausted after days of hard riding and hard fighting. They stacked their arms, built cooking fires, and settled in for what they expected to be a full night's rest. Sumter posted sentries, but he did not expect a serious threat. Cornwallis had just fought a major battle. No British commander, Sumter reasoned, would dispatch a significant force so quickly after such an engagement. The Gamecock had misjudged his enemy. Cornwallis did not rest after Camden. He sent Tarleton. The orders reached Tarleton on the evening of August 17th. He was to pursue Sumter immediately, with no delay for rest or resupply. Tarleton assembled a force of roughly 350 men from his legion, a mix of cavalry and mounted infantry. They left the Camden battlefield at sunset and rode hard into the darkness. All through the night, Tarleton's legion pushed northwest along the banks of the Wateree. The August heat did not break after dark. The air stayed thick and humid, heavy with the scent of river mud and pine resin. Men rode in silence, their faces streaked with sweat and road dust. Tarleton allowed no stops. Horses were pushed to the edge of collapse. Several mounts gave out during the night march and were abandoned where they fell. The riders doubled up with comrades or ran alongside the column on foot, determined not to be left behind. Tarleton maintained the pace because he understood exactly what he was hunting. Sumter had just seized supplies and prisoners meant for the main army. If he escaped, Cornwallis's victory at Camden would be diminished by the embarrassment of losing critical materiel to a partisan raid. Catching Sumter was not just a tactical objective. It was a matter of restoring the aura of British invincibility that Camden had supposedly secured. By mid-morning on August 18th, Tarleton had covered roughly 40 miles and reached the vicinity of Sumter's camp. His scouts crept forward through the underbrush to survey the American position. What they reported must have confirmed every instinct Tarleton possessed. Sumter's sentries were lax. The American camp was spread out along the creek, with men sleeping in the open, cooking breakfast, or tending to their horses. The captured British supply wagons sat in the center of the camp, still loaded with ammunition and provisions. The prisoners Sumter had taken were under guard near the creek bank. Nobody expected an attack. Tarleton formed his men into assault columns in the tree line, using hand signals to coordinate the deployment. The cavalry would hit the camp first, riding straight through the center to create chaos and break any attempt at forming a defensive line. The mounted infantry would follow to mop up resistance. The signal was given. Hoofbeats thundered out of the tree line as the British Legion cavalry burst into the open. Sabers caught the morning sunlight. Men's voices rose in the harsh, guttural shouts of a cavalry charge. Sumter's camp had roughly 30 seconds of warning. It was not enough. The first wave of Tarleton's horsemen crashed into the camp before most of the Americans had reached their stacked muskets. Riders slashed downward with their sabers, cutting men down as they stumbled out of their blankets. Mounted infantry dismounted and advanced with bayonets fixed, driving through the tents and supply wagons. The Americans who could grab weapons fired back. The ones who could not ran for the woods. Sumter himself was reportedly asleep when the attack began. He scrambled out of his tent, saw that the camp was already overrun, and fled on an unsaddled horse. Many of his officers followed. The fighting was brief and one-sided. Tarleton's men swept through the camp, killing those who resisted and disarming those who surrendered. According to British records, approximately 150 Americans were killed. Another 300 were captured and taken prisoner. The entire supply train Sumter had captured at the Wateree River was retaken by the British. Tarleton also recovered the roughly 100 British prisoners Sumter had been holding. The Americans lost every piece of artillery, every wagon of ammunition, and nearly every weapon they had stacked in the camp. Tarleton's casualties were minimal. The attack at Fishing Creek was not a battle in any conventional sense. It was an execution of speed. Sumter's force, which had been the most significant Patriot threat in South Carolina after the fall of Charleston, was effectively destroyed in under an hour. The Gamecock escaped into the swamps with a handful of his closest men. It would take him months to rebuild his command. News of Fishing Creek rippled through the Carolinas with the same speed that characterized Tarleton's campaigns. Patriot supporters described it as another atrocity, another massacre of sleeping Americans by the Butcher and his legion. British supporters described it as a brilliant tactical stroke that demonstrated the futility of resisting the Crown. Both descriptions contained elements of the truth. Tarleton had executed a textbook surprise attack with extraordinary discipline and speed. The operation was militarily brilliant by any standard of the era, but the manner of the attack, the killing of men who were half asleep and barely armed, the burning of the camp, and the relentless pursuit of those who fled, reinforced every story the Patriot propagandists were telling. For every colonist who heard about Fishing Creek and decided resistance was hopeless, another colonist heard about it and decided that the British could never be trusted. Aidanus Burke did not need to exaggerate the events at Fishing Creek. The facts alone were sufficient. He described the unarmed men cut down while crawling out of their blankets. He cataloged the list of the dead, with their names and their home counties, so that every reader in South Carolina would recognize someone they knew. He contrasted Tarleton's claims to military honor with the reality of what had happened at a sleeping camp on a hot August morning. The pamphlets from Burke's pen were distributed across the backcountry, carried by riders who risked hanging if they were caught with seditious materials. Tavern keepers kept copies behind their bars and read them aloud after dark. Militia officers folded them into their pockets and pulled them out at recruiting musters. The message was always the same. This is what the British do. This is what happens if you trust their promises of fair treatment. This is why you must fight. Colonel Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, was operating in the Low Country during the summer and fall of 1780. He read the reports from Fishing Creek and drew his own conclusions. Marion was a cautious commander by temperament. He favored small raids, precise strikes, and rapid retreats into terrain where British cavalry could not follow. He never allowed his men to sleep in the same camp 2 nights in a row. He never assumed that speed or distance could protect him from Tarleton. The Swamp Fox understood something that Sumter had learned too late. The only defense against Tarleton was to never be where he expected you to be. Marion's men lived in the swamps, moving through water channels that British maps did not record. They slept in hidden camps, accessible only by paths that a horse could not navigate. When Tarleton pursued them, which he did repeatedly, the trail simply vanished into the cypress trees and black water. Tarleton reportedly grew frustrated enough to declare that the old Swamp Fox could not be caught, giving Marion the nickname that became legend. The propaganda war intensified with every raid and counter-raid. Tarleton's reputation as a butcher was now firmly established in the American press. His name appeared in songs and broadsides, always paired with images of slaughter and betrayal. British officers who served with him later wrote that he seemed genuinely baffled by the hatred directed at him. He considered himself a soldier doing a soldier's work. The bayonet was a standard weapon of 18th century warfare. The execution of prisoners who had taken up arms against the Crown was not illegal by the military codes of the time. But Tarleton failed to grasp, or chose to ignore, that the rules of European warfare did not translate cleanly to a civil conflict in the American backcountry. These were not foreign soldiers fighting on a distant continent. These were neighbors killing neighbors. Every colonist who watched Tarleton's legion burn a farm knew that the family inside had been sleeping in that house a week earlier. Every militiaman who found a hanged partisan swinging from an oak tree recognized the face of a man he had grown up alongside. The psychology of the conflict could not be separated from its brutality, and Tarleton, for all his tactical brilliance, seemed unable or unwilling to understand that his methods were creating more enemies than they eliminated. Cornwallis recognized the problem, at least partially. In his dispatches to London, he continued to praise Tarleton's military effectiveness, while also acknowledging the difficulties of pacifying a population that had been radicalized by the violence of the occupation. The British strategy in the South depended on rallying loyalist support. Thousands of colonists, perhaps a majority in some regions, had remained loyal to the Crown at the start of the war. British planners believed that if the King's army could establish control, those loyalists would rise up and help govern the territory. But the cycle of atrocity and retaliation was eroding that hope. Loyalists who had been willing to openly support the British found themselves targeted by Patriot partisans. Their farms were burned, their families threatened, their lives made impossible. Many of them turned to Tarleton for protection. Tarleton's answer was more violence against the Patriot population. The spiral tightened. By the autumn of 1780, large stretches of the South Carolina backcountry were effectively lawless. Armed bands roamed the countryside, claiming allegiance to one side or the other, but often operating as little more than raiding parties. The formal war between armies was becoming a civil war of extermination. Tarleton remained at the center of the maelstrom, driving his legion at a pace that no other British unit could match. He continued to win tactical victories. He continued to disperse Patriot formations wherever he found them. But the strategic cost of those victories was mounting. Every attack that killed a dozen partisans created a dozen more from the families and neighbors of the dead. Every village that submitted after a visit from the Legion harbored resentment that would boil over the moment the British column moved on. The occupation of South Carolina was a body with an infection spreading under the skin. Tarleton was the sharpest instrument the British possessed for cutting out the infection, but the instrument was so sharp that it was cutting healthy tissue along with the disease. The Loyalist population, which Cornwallis desperately needed to maintain order, was increasingly afraid to cooperate with British forces publicly. If they did, they would be marked for Patriot retribution the moment Tarleton rode on to the next engagement. The political calculus was slipping away from the British command, and Tarleton was not the man to reverse it. He was a weapon, not a diplomat. He understood pursuit, destruction, and the application of terror. He did not understand the delicate work of rebuilding civil society in a population that had come to see his green-jacketed dragoons as agents of slaughter. As the autumn of 1780 gave way to winter, the southern colonies remained technically under British control. Charleston, Savannah, and Augusta were garrisoned. The Continental Army in the South had been shattered at Camden and had not yet reconstituted, but the backcountry was burning and the partisans were multiplying. Francis Marion was still in the swamps, Thomas Sumter was regrouping, and a new American commander was riding south from the mountains. His name was Daniel Morgan, and he had spent the summer studying Tarleton's tactics with the cold patience of a man who knew how to build a trap. Morgan noted the pattern of every engagement. Tarleton attacked with overwhelming speed. He drove his men to the point of collapse to close the distance before the enemy could prepare. He trusted the shock of his cavalry charge to break resistance before a defensive line could form. Morgan understood something that Sumter had not. The way to beat Tarleton was not to run faster. It was to stand still, pick the ground carefully, and let Tarleton come to you. The trap would require nerve, discipline, and a kind of courage that was hard to find in men who had been running from Tarleton's legion for 6 months. Morgan had all three. He began recruiting and training a force in the backcountry during the late autumn of 1780. He gathered Continental veterans who had survived Camden, Virginia riflemen who could hit a man at 200 yards, and militia who had personal reasons to want Tarleton dead. Morgan did not hide his intentions. He told his men they were going to fight the British Legion. He told them they were going to stand and win. Many of them did not believe him. They had heard too many stories of Tarleton's charges smashing through American lines before the defenders could reload. But Morgan had a plan built on the cold mathematics of terrain and timing. He would position his militia in the front line, with orders to fire 2 volleys and then withdraw. Behind them, on a low ridge, he would place his Continentals. the veterans who would not break. Tarleton would see the militia, assume the American line was weak, and charge headlong into a killing ground. Morgan was not trying to fight Tarleton on equal terms. He was trying to use Tarleton's aggression as the mechanism of his own destruction. The speed that had carried the British Legion through every engagement would drive them straight into the one position they could not overrun. The Butcher's Trail led inexorably toward that ridge in the South Carolina upcountry. The cows were grazing there in the cold January grass, and they had no idea that two armies were converging on their pasture. The ground was frozen hard on the morning of January 17, 1781. Frost clung to the brown grass of a broad pasture in the South Carolina upcountry. Local farmers called this place the Cowpens, a winter grazing field for cattle. Now it would serve a different purpose. Daniel Morgan stood among his men before dawn, moving from campfire to campfire. He was 44 years old, a veteran of the French and Indian War who had survived being shot through the mouth by a musket ball. The scar on his cheek was visible in the firelight as he spoke to the militia gathered around him. He told them not to be afraid of the green-jacketed dragoons. He told them to fire 2 shots and then fall back to the second line. He did not use stirring rhetoric or grand language. Morgan spoke in the rough, plain terms of a frontiersman who had spent years hauling wagons and fighting Indians. The men listened because Morgan had the kind of authority that came from having been shot at more times than most of them had been alive. His battle plan was simple enough to fit on a scrap of paper. But the simplicity was deceptive. Morgan had designed a layered trap that used Tarleton's own tactics as the engine of his destruction. The first line consisted of roughly 150 militia riflemen, many of them from Georgia and the Carolinas. Their orders were to spread out in a loose skirmish formation behind a screen of trees. When the British advanced, the riflemen were to aim for the officers first. Morgan knew from experience that British infantry lost cohesion without their sergeants and lieutenants shouting orders. After taking their shots, the skirmishers would withdraw to the second line. The second line was a larger body of militia, about 300 men under Colonel Andrew Pickens. These were part-time soldiers, farmers, and shopkeepers who had drilled for weeks but had never faced a British bayonet charge in formation. Morgan positioned them roughly 150 yards behind the skirmish line. He gave them explicit instructions that went against every instinct a militia soldier possessed. He told them to stand and deliver 2 volleys at close range, then retreat in good order around the left flank of the Continentals waiting behind them. Most commanders would never have asked militia to hold against a charge. Morgan was betting that 2 volleys at 50 yards would gut Tarleton's assault before the retreat became a rout, and he made sure every man in that line knew where to go when the order came. The third line was the anchor, the men who would not run. Roughly 450 Continental regulars from Maryland and Delaware, the survivors of Camden, and a dozen other battles lost but not forgotten. Morgan positioned them on a low ridge, slightly elevated above the pasture, with their flanks resting on terrain features that prevented a cavalry envelopment. Behind the ridge, hidden in a shallow hollow, waited Lieutenant Colonel William Washington's cavalry detachment. 80 to 100 dragoons mounted on horses that had been fed and rested through the night. Morgan also placed a reserve of militia riflemen in the rear, men who had personal scores to settle with Tarleton. The topography of the trap was invisible from the front. Tarleton would see the militia skirmishers and the second line behind them. He would assume the American position was weak, held by the same kind of partisans he had routed at Fishing Creek. The hill screened the Continentals and the cavalry from view. By the time Tarleton realized what he was charging into, it would be too late to stop. Morgan walked the lines before sunrise, checking positions, adjusting angles of fire, and speaking to his officers in low, deliberate tones. He was suffering from severe sciatica that made every step agony. His back was so inflamed that he had been carried to the battlefield on a litter, but he refused to let his men see him in pain. He propped himself against a tree and gave his final orders with a calm that steadied every soldier within earshot. Somewhere to the northeast, Tarleton was already moving. The British Legion had been marching through the night. Tarleton had received word that Morgan was in the vicinity, and he had immediately pushed his men into a forced march to close the distance. He did not stop to rest the horses. He did not stop to let the infantry eat. He drove his column through the freezing darkness with the same brutal urgency he had applied at Monk's Corner and Fishing Creek. At roughly 3 o'clock in the morning, Tarleton's scouts reported that Morgan had stopped at the Cowpens and appeared to be preparing for battle. Tarleton accelerated the advance. He wanted to hit Morgan before the Americans had time to dig in or receive reinforcements. The British commander believed this was another opportunity to smash a colonial force before it could organize a defense. His confidence was absolute. Dawn broke cold and gray over the pasture. Tarleton's column emerged from the tree line around 7 in the morning. The British soldiers were exhausted from the night march. They had been moving for nearly 12 hours without food or rest. Their uniforms were damp with sweat and frost, their boots worn thin from weeks of hard campaigning in the Carolina backcountry. But Tarleton did not believe in resting before an engagement. He formed his men into a line of battle and prepared to attack immediately. The British force numbered roughly 1,100 men. Tarleton's own British Legion provided the cavalry and a strong contingent of light infantry, the green-jacketed dragoons who had terrorized the southern colonies for months. The 7th Regiment of Foot, the Royal Fusiliers, provided the core of the regular infantry. A detachment of the 71st Highlanders, the same regiment that had shattered the American line at Camden, stood ready on the left flank. Artillery support came from 2 light cannons, 3-pounder grasshopper guns that could be moved quickly across open ground. Tarleton surveyed the American position from horseback and saw exactly what Morgan wanted him to see. A thin screen of skirmishers in front, a larger militia formation behind them. No visible Continentals, no cavalry, no fortifications beyond the natural slope of the pasture. Tarleton believed he was looking at a larger version of the force he had scattered at Fishing Creek. He ordered an advance across the open ground. The British line began moving forward, drums beating, bayonets fixed, the red-coated infantry stepping off in the disciplined formation that had conquered empires. The Georgia and Carolina riflemen in the American skirmish line waited behind the trees. They had been told to pick their targets carefully, and they did. As the British reached 150 yards, the crack of American long rifles began to punch through the cold morning air. British officers started falling. A captain of the 7th Foot went down with a rifle ball through his chest. A lieutenant of the Highlanders collapsed with his thigh shattered. Sergeants, the men who held the line together with their voices and their halberds, dropped into the frozen grass. The skirmishers kept firing for 3 minutes, then withdrew as ordered, melting back through the trees toward Pickett's militia line. The British infantry continued forward. Their officers reformed the ranks, closed the gaps where the dead had fallen, and kept the advance moving. The drums did not falter. Tarleton committed his reserve infantry, sending the 71st Highlanders forward on the left flank to envelop the American position. The Highlanders moved at a fast march, their kilts swinging, their officers calling the cadence. They were the regiment that had broken the American center at Camden. Tarleton expected them to do the same at Cowpens. The militia in the second line saw the red-coated mass approaching across the pasture. The distance closed from 100 yards to 80, then 60. The British infantry kept coming, their bayonets level, their boots crushing the frost-hardened grass. At 50 yards, Pickens gave the order. The militia fired a volley that tore through the British front rank. Men fell in clusters, the bodies piling up in the gap between the 2 lines. The militia reloaded, fired a second volley, and then executed Morgan's plan. They turned and ran. This was the moment that had destroyed every American line Tarleton had faced. The militia broke formation, streamed around the left flank of the Continentals behind them, and disappeared over the ridge. To the British soldiers watching from the killing ground, it looked like a rout. Tarleton saw the American second line collapse and gave the order that had won him every engagement of his career. He sent the British Legion cavalry charging into what he believed was a shattered enemy. The green-jacketed dragoons spurred their horses and thundered up the shallow slope. They expected to ride down fleeing militia. Instead, they ran headlong into the Continental line. The Maryland and Delaware regulars were waiting on the ridge, their bayonets fixed, their formation dressed with parade ground precision. When the British cavalry crested the rise, the Continentals leveled their muskets and fired a volley at 30 yards. The effect was annihilating. Horses screamed and collapsed. Dragoons were thrown from their saddles, their green jackets shredded by musket balls. The cavalry charge shattered against the Continental line like a wave hitting a seawall. The surviving dragoons wheeled their horses and fled back down the slope. Now the British infantry was advancing into the same trap. The 7th Foot and the Highlanders, believing the Americans were in retreat, pushed forward up the ridge. They were exhausted from the night march. Their ammunition was running low. The morning sun was now fully above the tree line, shining directly into their eyes. And when they reached the crest of the ridge, they found not a broken militia force, but 450 disciplined Continentals with bayonets leveled. Morgan was on his horse among the Marylanders, despite the agony in his back, calling out orders. He ordered the Continentals to fire by ranks. The first rank knelt, aimed, and fired. The second rank fired over their heads. The third rank reloaded, while the first two kept up the volleys. The British infantry were caught in the open, 30 yards from the Continental line, with no cover and no momentum left. The 7th Foot tried to fix bayonets and charge, but the volume of American fire was too heavy. The Highlanders on the left flank pushed harder, trying to turn the American right. For a moment, the British seemed to be gaining ground. The Highlanders were closing with the Continentals, their broadswords drawn, their officers shouting the war cries of the regiment. Morgan saw the danger. He rode to the right flank and ordered the Virginians to refuse the line, bending it back at an angle to prevent the Highlanders from rolling up the American position. The maneuver required the Virginians to turn 45 degrees while still firing. They executed it with a discipline that no British officer would have believed possible from colonial troops. The Highlanders ran into a wall of lead and stopped. Then Morgan gave the command that broke the British army. He ordered the Continentals to fix bayonets and charge. The Marylanders and Virginians surged forward down the ridge, their bayonets glittering in the cold January sunlight. At the same moment, William Washington's cavalry burst from their hiding place behind the hollow and crashed into the British right flank. The militia, who had reformed in the rear, came back onto the field and poured fire into the British left. The British line collapsed from 3 directions simultaneously. Soldiers of the 7th Foot began throwing down their muskets. The Highlanders, surrounded and outnumbered, started raising their hands. Tarleton rode among his men, shouting for them to hold, to reform, to fight. But this was not Fishing Creek. The Legion was breaking, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The dragoons, who had terrorized the Carolinas for nearly a year, were surrendering in clumps of 20 or 30 at a time. British officers handed over their swords. Infantrymen knelt in the frost-covered grass with their hands on their heads. Tarleton gathered roughly 200 of his remaining cavalry and tried to organize a countercharge. He led the horsemen toward the American right, looking for a gap in the encirclement. But William Washington saw him coming and charged to meet him. The two cavalry forces collided at the base of the ridge, sabers against sabers, in the last organized British resistance of the battle. William Washington and Tarleton nearly crossed blades personally. The two commanders came within feet of each other, their horses pushing through the chaos of slashing men and screaming wounded animals. But the American cavalry was too strong, too fresh, and too numerous. Tarleton's countercharge broke apart. He gathered the survivors, perhaps 50 men, and fled the field. The Battle of Cowpens was over. The butcher had been butchered. The British casualties were staggering. Roughly 100 men killed, including many officers whose names Tarleton would list with regret in his memoirs. Over 700 soldiers captured, virtually the entire infantry component of Tarleton's force. American losses were estimated at 25 killed and 124 wounded. The ratio of casualties was so lopsided that it defied every assumption the British command had held about the relative fighting quality of colonial troops. Tarleton's Legion, the unit that had seemed unstoppable from Monck's Corner to Fishing Creek, had been effectively destroyed in less than an hour. The 2 Grasshopper cannons were captured. The British colors were taken. The prisoners were marched to the rear in a column that stretched for a quarter mile. Morgan had planned a trap, and Tarleton had walked into it with his eyes open and his confidence unshaken until the moment the Continentals crested the ridge. Tarleton later published his own account of the battle in his 1787 history of the Southern campaigns. He blamed the defeat on the exhaustion of his troops and the failure of the 7th Foot to maintain their formation. He wrote that the Americans attacked with overwhelming numbers, though the records show Morgan's force was actually slightly smaller. He insisted that the battle was a temporary setback, not a decisive defeat, but nobody believed him. Cornwallis received the news at his headquarters and immediately recognized the scale of the disaster. The loss of 700 trained infantry and most of Tarleton's Legion left a hole in the British Southern Army that could not be filled quickly. The militias that Cornwallis had hoped to recruit from the Loyalist population now had a powerful reason to stay home. The Patriots had proof that Tarleton could be beaten. Not just beaten, destroyed. The raw statistics from Cowpens traveled through the Carolinas faster than any British courier. Morgan's victory was reported in newspapers from Philadelphia to Charleston, each account adding to the legend. The Continental commander, who had been carried onto the field on a litter, had dismantled the most feared British officer in the South. The militia, who had learned to run from Tarleton, had stood and fought and won. Cornwallis now faced a strategic dilemma that the victory at Cowpens made acute. His southern army had been built around the mobility that Tarleton's legion provided. With the legion gutted, Cornwallis could no longer range freely across the backcountry, chasing Patriot partisans. Every day he spent waiting for reinforcements allowed the Americans to grow stronger. Morgan, even in victory, understood that the campaign was not over. He ordered his army to retreat north toward Virginia, carrying the prisoners and captured supplies with him. Cornwallis, enraged by the defeat, decided to pursue Morgan personally. He gathered his remaining forces, burned his own baggage train to increase speed, and set off on a chase that would drag the British Army deep into the Carolina interior. The race toward the Dan River had begun. Cornwallis was now abandoning his supply lines, cutting his army loose from its base of support and plunging into country where every farmhouse contained a potential enemy. He was chasing Daniel Morgan, who had already proven he knew how to set a trap. And somewhere ahead of both armies, waiting in Virginia with a new Continental force, was Nathaniel Greene. Greene had been watching the Southern campaign unfold through the reports of his subordinates. He had seen Tarleton's rampage, Morgan's victory, and Cornwallis's desperate pursuit. He knew the British commander was now overextended, cut off from supply, and driven by the rage of a professional soldier who had been humiliated by a man with a bad back and a militia force of farmers. Greene began preparing a reception. The terrain of North Carolina offered opportunities that the South Carolina backcountry lacked. Rivers that could be crossed only at narrow fords. Hills that provided observation points for miles in every direction. A local population that had watched Tarleton's legion burn its way across the southern colonies and was eager to repay the debt. The remnants of Tarleton's command were still with Cornwallis as the chase began. Tarleton himself had survived Cowpens with his reputation in ruins, but his life intact. He remained an aggressive commander, still convinced that speed and shock could win the war. But the men under him were not the same soldiers who had ridden through the night to surprise Sumter at Fishing Creek. Too many of those men were dead or prisoners. The replacements were raw, the horses were worn, and the aura of invincibility that had carried the Legion through impossible engagements was gone. The Cowpens had broken something in the British Southern Army that no victory could repair. It had broken the certainty that Tarleton would always win.